Patch 10.12 brings crucial balance changes to top and bottom performers, as well as new SPL skins, battle passes, and more. Here's everything you need to know in 8 minutes. Quickly before we start though, there's a gem sale going on over at my Nexus store right now where you can get gems up to 33% off for the next 2 weeks. If you're looking to cop some cheap gems to grab some new skins, buying them here helps support the channel at no extra cost to you. Big thanks to anyone that goes through my link, it's a huge help for the channel. So kicking things off as usual with the skins. Poseidon is a recolor of the original Poseidon and is part of the Color Forge event, so its color scheme can be changed with dyes. Intergalactic Harvester Thanatos is also part of this event. Camelot's King Maui and Rainbow Warrior Ishel are both part of the new World Champions SPL Battle Pass, along with the new team-themed skins for Wukong, Bellona, Zeus, Apollo, Aokwang, Susano, Nemesis, and Poseidon. These are either in the new Battle Pass or in the esports chest, depending on which one you're after. And finally for skins, we have the 2 Winter Wonderland chest skins in Midnight Freeze X-Bal and Yul'Shir Aphrodite. Moving into balance changes though, first up, the shield buff in Conquest has been nerfed in the protections it provides, going from 1 per level to 0.5 per level. This gives 10 base, so it's gone down from 30 prots to 20 prots at level 20. Moving on to item balance, Absolution gets 50 more health, Abyssal Stone gets 5 more magical protections but the physical remains the same. Amulet of Silence now only needs to stack 3 times to get the silence instead of 4 and has a reduced internal cooldown. Arendite gets a pretty major buff with the item now having 7% movement speed on it flat regardless of the passive effect. That passive was nerfed by 10% to compensate for this, but having 7% all the time versus 10% rarely is definitely a worthwhile trade. Expect to see a good bit more of this item. The stats on it are actually pretty exceptional now, and the passive is also really good. Brawler's Beatstick gets 5 more physical power, Corrupted Bluestone gets buffed, which is a bit scary as this item is already underrated but a little bit niche. It gets 1 more tick of damage and 1% more protections per stack. This stacks 5 times, so that's a total of 5% more increase. Not a small change by any means. Last Gasp gets his passive adjusted so the buff duration and the internal cooldown are now both 8 seconds, meaning the passive power from this item is, in theory, always up. Mail of Renewal now heals allies over 5 seconds instead of 10. This won't affect your own personal heal from the item, which is instant, but it will make the item more viable for burst healing your own backliners in teamfights. Manticore Spikes gets 50 extra health for some reason. This item was fine before and I definitely would have looked at a few other tank items before this one in my opinion. Was already worth building on a lot of tanks and is even more so now. Mantle of Discord gets a well-deserved cost reduction of 150 gold. This item always felt a little bit too expensive for what it did, so this could make it more competitive in tank builds and perhaps even as a single defense option on squishies now that, spoiler, Breastplate is being nerfed. Relic Dagger and its glyphs now reduce relics by 50 seconds instead of 40 seconds. Pretty nice buffs overall, and combined with the buffs to Eldritch Dagger recently, it could see some play. Sentinel's Boon now restores 4% max health instead of 3% and gives 20 assist gold rather than 15. Pretty nice for the item and it will be broken in Assault, but in Conquest you mostly want other support options that keep your backline alive, like Embrace, Heroism or Compassion. We'll see where this lands though, as 24% max health just for assisting a minion wave is kinda crazy. Silverbranch Bow gets a noticeable buff, now providing 3 power per 0.2% attack speed overcap instead of 2 power. The ADC meta right now doesn't really fit this item too well, but it could change around it as this is a really strong buff. Staff of Muradin gets 50 gold cheaper, not gonna matter all things considered. Vision Shard wards now last 90 seconds instead of 60 seconds, but you're still not gonna buy it. Shh, your secret's safe with me. Warrior's Axe and both its upgrades get buffs this patch too. The base item now restores more health and mana on hit, Animosity gets 50 more health, and Sundering now deals 2% of your prots instead of 1.5%. Watch out for this item, when it's strong, it's real strong, and these buffs are no joke. As mentioned earlier, Breastplate of Determination gets a revert back to 5 protections per stack instead of 7. With how this item works, that's a loss of 32 total protections, 16 of each kind, when this thing is maxed out, so this is a bigger nerf than it looks like. Fabless Hoops now has an internal cooldown, which is a huge nerf. The main strength of the item was the constant shielding, and 10 seconds can be most of a teamfight in the late game, so this item is severely hampered by having a cooldown like this. Fail Not no longer reduces enemy damage output, which it never should have in the first place. This item still does like 5 different things for you though, so I wouldn't expect it to be completely dead from this change. Telkine's Ring loses 5 power and 5 of the bonus base damage, should hurt magical ADCs early game quite a bit as they are dominant in the meta at the moment. Pythagorean's Piece and its associated tier 1 and tier 2 item all got 50 gold more expensive, while Pythags itself loses 50 health too. And finally for items, Vampiric Shroud and Bloodsoaked Shroud both lose firepower, probably not that relevant. Alright, moving on to god buffs, first up is AMC, who gets an increased projectile speed on his 2 to make it easier to confirm at far ranges. Atlas gets more base physical procs, and his ult now reduces enemy power by 3% per stack instead of 2%. This effect can stack up to 7 times, so this is a pretty solid buff. Chak gets 5% more scaling on Axe and more base damage as you rank up Torrent. Kukulkan gets more damage on Ventanger, which is whatever, but his ult now scales down to 80 seconds in the late game when it was 100 seconds flat before. Big change, as this is Kuku's only CC without rage mode, and it generates a large burst of rage, so this could definitely help out his teamfight quite a lot. Danza gets more base damage on his jar, while his 3 has been changed to give less mitigation total, but it now works on all damage, not just basic attacks, a buff overall for sure. Fenrir gets 1 second off of his 1's cooldown, and Brutalize now channels in 1.35 seconds instead of 1.5 seconds. This ability is notoriously hard to get all the damage out of, but speeding it up will help, and this ability does hit like a truck if you can't cancel it in time. Plus, Fenrir wasn't exactly terrible anyway before these buffs. Huyi gets 5% more scaling on his 1 and a decreased cooldown on his mark in the early game, but it's the same late game. Nemesis gets some pretty big buffs, mainly with her dash now scaling down to 11 seconds in the late game when it was 14 seconds flat before. This, along with more damage on her 2 and the Arendite buff, could bring her back into the meta in a big way. Expect to see a lot more Nemesis. Ra gets 5% more scaling on his 2 and 1 second off of his 3's cooldown, not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. Shiva gets 10% more mitigation while in his 3, also not a huge deal. Tsukuyomi gets knock-up immunity finally added back to his 2. This was really strong when it worked this way on launch, but the game has come a long way in terms of power creep since Season 6, so I don't expect this to make Suku broken, but definitely better. Vulcan gets more turret base damage and a larger minimum damage on his ult when firing at close range. Yumiya's 2 gets a pretty nice quality of life buff as well, with a reduced pre-fire time making it come out quicker and easier to connect in a fight. And finally, a few god nerfs. Athena's attack speed reduction on Taunt now scales from 20% to 30% rather than 30% flat at all ranks. This will make very little difference as you tend to max this ability first on Athena anyway, and it's only a 10% change even at rank 1. Baba Yaga now requires more cabin essence to stack items. It's roughly 25% slower now, while the base damage on her potions was also taken down slightly. Chernobog's passive explosion went from 20% of his basic attack damage to 15%. Crystallized Curses now scales down less to 13 seconds in the late game rather than 11 seconds, while Vicious Barrage goes from 7 seconds to 8 seconds. Solid Cherno nerfs overall, though I do think his ult is the main problem and not this stuff. Maman Brigitte loses her knock-up immunity on the 1. It won't massively change how she feels to fight, but in certain matchups she will have a much harder time now. Anyone with an on-demand knock-up can cancel her stun animation, as it does take quite a while to come out, and this will eat the cooldown, which is a big deal. And finally, Raijin gets 3 decent nerfs to his cooldowns. The passive now reduces 1.5 seconds instead of 2 seconds, his 1 goes up by 2 seconds, and his 3 goes up in the early game, but it's the same late game. Solid nerfs for Raijin overall, and he should feel a bit less like he always has an ability up now.